Contour. So really simply, contour is just describing the surface of things that you're drawing on. So in a simple rectilinear three-dimensional shape, right? This is one plane of that space. This is another plane of that space. This is yet another plane of that space, et cetera, et cetera. So in a flat geometric shape like this, this would be one contour. This would be another contour of that shape. It's describing the surface of that particular thing so that you've got a rough idea of its three-dimensionality, how the thing moves, et cetera. With curved object, it's hardly any different. Right? Although now the contour of that thing becomes curvilinear with a series of ellipses or circles, right? Whatever the case may be, right? Defining the overall right, shape of that thing. Now we can simplify those contours, right? So I could take a contour like this, for instance, and break it up into a series of angles, potentially an infinite series of angles as a way of making that feel a little bit more accurate to describe its contour, right? And ultimately, then this was what I was suggesting when we were going over blocking, is that you can take those contour lines, albeit those contour lines that are describing the silhouette of a particular thing, and break it up into these easier to manage straight lines in order to represent things with a little bit more accuracy and a little bit more ease. Now, the exterior line of a thing is pretty easy for us to understand as being a line that's useful in terms of describing that thing, right? And is also a contour line. Right? So if this was the side of a leg, for example, that becomes an intuitively obvious way of describing that thing and an intuitively obvious use of contour, because this is the way that we've been describing things ever since we were children. It's basically surrounding an object with a line so that we can separate it from space. What's not necessarily so obvious is how do you use those contour lines on the inside as a way of providing yet another way of establishing volume to a pose. So as, you know, for instance, I'm traveling from one side of an object to the other side of the object, that line is literally determining what section of the object I'm at. And if I had, say, a light source that was coming in here, the direction of our shadow shape or our shadow value as we pull this in kind of indirectly describes one of those planes or a multiplicity of those planes as light can't contact or penetrate to that area. So we can use contour lines and we can use value direction and value itself as a way of contributing to a sense of three-dimensionality, as well as then accentuating that with the characteristics of value. Now this gets a little bit more complicated when we're dealing with things, well, more complicated. So let's say that we're dealing with something like the torso. Well, the torso, in effect, is a big tube or a big rectangle that obviously has, you know, more complexity attached to it. So when we start to put in our rib cage into this shape and break that rib cage up along a center line, and then start to add onto that rib cage an idea of the pelvis. With these generic shapes that we've been going over. All these things are designed as a way of adding volume, but also adding like an understanding of how we can represent that volume in a number of different ways. So these landmarks that we've been going over, for instance, right, of this thing here lining up with that thing there, right, where the underside of that rib cage is, where your pectorals are. Right, what your arm looks like as it is inserting into that, and you know, potentially even what the shape of a deltoid is. By identifying these center lines and these volumes in terms of how they connect to each other and interrelate, what we're ultimately doing is providing more and more of a guideline. And as we develop for details, and as we develop that guideline, what you're indirectly doing is also developing a sense of volume. That sense of volume can be presented though in a number of different ways. Right? So for instance, a really simple contour of that torso would be something like this, as it captures kind of what's happening with the rib cage. Now, problematically, is that when you get into an area, say like the pectorals, well, the pectorals now start to have a much more complicated sense of contour as they take on their own much more specific three-dimensionality. So rather than just having this one single curve, what I get is a multiplicity of planes and contours as the line flows over top of a lat, rib cage, side of the pectoral, top of the pectoral, sternum, side of the pectoral, etc., and then literally disappears in space. Same thing with the abdominal tract. As we break this thing up right, into these individual spaces, this is all nice, but that doesn't help us right, account for the change of direction, say, over top of the rib cage like this, and then as it goes down into the top of the rib cage, or over top of the torso like this, then down over top of the torso, and then down in from the torso into the abdominal tract. And then the bulges of each individual abdominal tract as they start to move in that direction. And likewise, we'll have a contour similarly as we move from, say, rib cage here down into abdominal tract, over top of abdominal tract, into the middle of it, right, into the middle of it again, and then into, in this case, the rib cage slash obliques. Here, I have that contour would change again. As it corresponds to a totally different section of the body. Now that combined with overlap, combined with that underlying drawing, all of this starts to contribute in a variety of ways to how to develop volume in the pose. Right? So when we're going into this area here with your deltoid and pectoral, this becomes a really complicated intersection because now we've got a contour moving like this, like that, and then like that, depending on the section that we're dealing with. Now, this isn't going to be just like everything else that we go over in this class, irritating. This isn't going to be useful in absolutely every instance, but this becomes another tool right, that you can use as a way of starting to identify right, the three-dimensionality of a particular thing. So when we're looking at the back, for instance, I like the fact that a lot of you put in the chat that the back is comparatively easy to draw. I find exactly the opposite. I find the back to be an absolute fucking nightmare to draw most of the time. Because even with these additions to a more user-friendly way of developing these things, so much is still left out that kind of glosses over the complexity of this. But anyway, for me, it becomes anything but simple. Okay, so say that we've got something like this as, your basic shape to your back. Well, that contour can function in a number of different ways. So this is a nice way of starting to break that space up. But it doesn't really tell you much about, say, the contour of this area, especially not as it bulges. right, when we start to raise that arm. So we can use contour as a way of starting to exaggerate that structure in one direction or another. And depending on what direction, these things are headed, we want that contour to go in a slightly different direction as well, because we can also use it as a way of conveying perspective. These lines conveying the fact that that deltoid is moving more in that direction, for instance. Whereas these lines conveying the fact that that deltoid is moving more in that direction. Likewise, we can use them, right, as directional lines to, say, convey the fact that I'm maybe looking down more on that object, or that this thing is bulging more like this, as opposed to like that. And you start to see is like how this becomes really complex as those things interrelate with each other. Now, one way that these can be used in order to convey a sense of volume is by shading in a different way as well. So let's say that I take this arm. I can start to put in lines that start to identify a turning edge to that area that might also be associated with a shadow. So rather than just having lines that do this, I can have lines that now physically start to accentuate the contour of an area, right? And those contour lines, right, might be, again, going something like this, and then they might shift direction as the shape itself shifts direction. It also doesn't have to correspond to shadow at all. They can just be another way of saying, all right, that surface is moving like that in that area, but with a slightly lighter line. So that, again, there's an implication that that whole thing is doing something simple like this, or when it starts to change direction again, introducing, again, other directional lines, so we get a multiplicity of contour lines. That are all starting to work with other ways of developing volume in order to, well, do exactly that, develop volume. Right, so these can be really useful in big sections, right? They can also be really useful in small sections as in yet another way of starting to identify different kinds of surfaces with respect to each other. Okay, would we like to see a demo of this, or are you guys tired of listening to me talk? Because I have been talking a lot today.
I think a demo would be nice.
Yeah, thank you.
Great. Okay, well, let's do something torso-y. Go ahead and screenshot this before I flip the page. Let's do something torso-y and interesting. Ezra, you know the terrain of interesting poses much better than I do. And I will try to apply this as best as my meager abilities allow.
Do you want it to be a certain length of time?
Yeah, let's do, it'll be between 5 and 10 minutes. So why don't you set the timer for 10 just to make sure? I'll probably stop you well before that. And just because we're concentrating on the back, let's do something 3/4 back or something like that. Maybe even some foreshortening, just for shits and giggles. Oh, coffee rounds at the bottom of my coffee. Gross. Burns. Now I got coffee grounds in my mouth. Gross. Okay, so again, this is just an additional tool. And again, the tendency as we start to develop more of these tools is to focus solely on that tool because it's fresh. All of everything essentially in the second half of the class is all about building on what we already have from the first half of the class. Course, whatever. Okay, so none of this, in other words, affects anything up until this stage, although there are overlaps right between them. Right, so some overlaps, right, being right this introduction of pelvic girdle, this introduction of the rib cage, right, etc. Right? I'm starting to overlap this idea of the lat, also rolling in this idea of the shoulder blade, using that as a guideline as to where my deltoid is as it wraps across that surface. Also using that overlap there as a way of developing volume. And so all of these things are in the service of developing volume. Likewise, you can see it's like up at the front, right, how that pectoral area starts to point towards the general direction of the distinction between my central abdominal tract here and then my obliques here. And then this shadow shape, in addition, starting to give a good indication of what's happening with the contour of this area. Right? So the reason that these cast shadows are so important and shadows themselves are so important is they start to indicate not only musculature, but they also indicate the shapes of the surfaces that musculature is casting shadows upon. And so for instance, that lat is physically casting a shadow down over top of the rib cage and then over top of the pectoral itself to varying degrees depending on where it is. So now I know that the rib cage is doing something like this as a really simple contour. But then also, and you can lightly see like a change of value right about here. That would be a good indication as to where that rib cage now changes contour into that lat and how that lat and its contour change altogether as this thing starts to cross over top of the surface of the body. Which means that as I come down below there, that contour again is going to change as I start to come down into the rib cage. Now, as I get down into this section here, there's obviously a shadow that's picking up. So I can start to identify both that contour and that shadow with a series of these contour lines that help to identify that section. And then likewise, as I'm coming over top of this area, you see as I'm changing that direction of that line, so that if we think about that as a really simple cylinder, and the light's hitting this area right here, that means that this dark area and this dark area would gradually be lightening up towards that dark, or towards that bright area. And that's essentially what I'm doing in that section there. And I can do the exact same thing in the opposite direction as the top of that pelvic girdle and oblique starts to move up into the underside of that rib cage. Okay, so we can have these things working at cross purposes to each other. You can also, again, use them as a really general directional device to help block in that sense of shadow. And then inside there, help to further exaggerate that sense of contour and direction. And you can get what's called cross contour lines going on as well. We're going to now bring the lines from the other direction contact with that in order to make that even more volumetric. Right, so this is essentially what crosshatching would be a version of. If you cup up into the bottom of that deltoid, this shadow shape helps to identify where all of this stuff is going to happen. And now I have a contour line that's going like this. But also, and importantly, a contour line that's going like this. And I want to think about that thing as rounding a particular point as it moves away from me. So if we think about that as a sphere, there's going to be a center line to that sphere. And as I start to round this direction, I'm getting closer and closer to that center line. And then that thing is rounding away from me. So that contour line changes once I get to a certain point, right, in order to tell me what's closest to me in this direction or furthest away from me in the other direction. And you'd have the exact same thing happening in the vertical sphere as well. And so for instance, if I was to put in contour lines like this, that helps to identify the fact that this is below my vantage point, right? Or I'm looking down on it to some degree. And each and every area is going to have this. So when we get into the leg, right, next week, right, there's going to be contour line here, contour line there, contour line there, big contour line here. That changes direction into a contour line here. That changes into other contour lines that are going like that, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, so again, these aren't detailed lines. What they are is another way of developing an underlying sense of volume. And ideally, again, we're doing this as a way of trying to make our drawings look good, as opposed to just treating these things like details. So when I put something like that in there, it might be for the purposes of providing a guideline for something like that, that's going to make that look better, as opposed to just something that is, all right, well, I know I'm supposed to draw contour lines and you're just drawing contour lines like this. That's never going to look good. This will help to contribute, right, to things looking better. Thanks, Ezra, that was great. Okay, how was that? That help? Make things clear? Clear as mud? Awesome, good talk. Right, let's go into, let's do some 15-minute poses, please, Ezra. We'll finish off with 3 15s. Okay, concentrating, and then Ezra, again, please, something from that shows off the back to some degree would be great. Okay, gang. Once again, we all know the drill. Okay, shoulder. So let's just talk about the shoulder from the side to begin with. Your shoulder, basic representation of it, we can think about as just, right, a ball, right, on either end of a tube. Why are you so angled? Stop it, stop it. And at the top of that tube, right, you have a triangle. Right, that triangle is your trapezius group for our purposes. On either side of that triangle, you have a little angle. You have a little angle here, that's your scapular spine. And you have a little angle here, that's your clavicle. And on the top section of it, you have a little flat section. And for our purposes, that's your acromion process. Your acromion process, you look at your shoulder blade, is this section of your shoulder. There's a flat ledge there. And if we look at the clavicle from the front, that clavicle and your shoulder blade basically relate like this to each other. So your clavicle comes up and kind of nestles in on top and inside of that acromion process. Now, the important part of this is that this section here points to about the midpoint of your shoulder. You want to think about your deltoid, or your shoulder rather, in a couple of different ways. And so first off, and most simply, is this shape. And that shape, relatively simple teardrop shape, comes down to about the 1/3 mark of your upper arm. And that third mark is going to be important, right, because that's also going to be replicated when we get into the development of your forearm, right? Whereas your forearm has a muscle that comes up to the bottom third of your upper arm. And so those thirds are relatively important. Now, your shoulder has 3 different heads to it. You have a medial head, you have an anterior head, fancy word for front, and you have a posterior head, fancy word for back. And when we say have that arm in different positions, right, or when you're looking at the shoulder from different positions, say we're looking at it from the front, and here's a nice simplified torso. And your simplified arm. As we went over a little bit with respect to the development of the torso, is that if this is your arm, your deltoid, again, sits on the front 1/3 of, or the exterior 1/3 of your clavicle, and now wraps around that shape of the arm, and then bulges out over top of that basic shape. This is a really useful skill to develop for muscles in general. And a simple exercise that you can use in terms of doing that is to practice drawing shapes that wrap around a surface. Right? So as shapes are wrapping around a cylinder, that's essentially what your deltoid is doing there. And so if you practice doing this, right, making these lines at speed will become significantly easier. Because what this is doing is attaching to the front and then wrapping around this cylindrical shape, this rough cylindrical shape of your upper arm, and attaching to the side of that particular thing. So it should feel like it's responding to the contour of that arm. As I mentioned, this sits on top of the arm, but then it also sits on top of your pectoral. So your pectoral has a couple of different sections to it. It's got a minimus section, right, that is attaching here, and then going and attaching to the front of your arm. But underneath your deltoid. And it has a maximus section that is pulling across like this and attaching to much the same point. And then it's forcing your bicep underneath both of those things. And then what makes up the leftover of the arm is the bit of the tricep that you can see poking up on either side of that. So what you have here as a result of this is this little triangular wedge that starts to develop here. That's literally a gap in between your pectorals and your deltoid at the 1/3 mark of your clavicle. So I messed that up. Right, but then you have this, because of this relationship of your pectoral attaching to the front of your arm, going underneath your deltoid, you have this predictable relationship that we've gone over: your deltoid, then pectoral, and then your bicep in terms of this overlap. And then underneath that, you have your rib cage going underneath your pectoral. And then, as I mentioned beforehand, your latissimus now comes up and goes in front of your tricep. So when we fill in this little wedge of space here, that little wedge of space is physically going in front of your tricep. And to talk about that more clearly, it's useful to look at this from the back. So there's my scapular spine. My trapezius is doing something. Yeah. Something like this. Basic arm is doing that. And what we've already done is essentially taken your lat and now brought it over top of the base of that shoulder blade and brought that to the front of your arm. Because here, your lat is coming forward now and attaching underneath your pectoral at the front of your arm. Now, this is the area that always is difficult, right, for people to grapple with, and rightfully so, right, because it's a pain in the ass. Same sort of representation of the deltoid from the back, except the deltoid is longer. So that just means that this curving shape, right, starts at that 2/3 mark as it moving in from the profile of the torso. And what that does is it essentially helps to close down the amount of space that you have in here. Now, what you can think about your shoulder blade also is, or as a good landmark for, is where your shoulder muscles attach. Now, you have a series of shoulder muscles, right, but they can easily be broken up like this. First off, you have this shape here. That shape there, right, is attaching to the medial border of your scapula, or of your scapula. Medial just meaning close to the median line or the middle of your line. Right? And then just like your lat is going to the front of your arm. Right? So those things are kind of stacking, if you could see straight through, those things are kind of stacking up like that. You get pectoral, then this muscle, then that muscle there. And then on top of that, you have a thinner line, a thinner shape that goes over top of that. So basically what you get is another muscle that goes in behind them. This is respectively called your teres minor and your teres major, and then your lat. And then you have this muscle here called your infraspinatus. These muscles are all what we refer to as our shoulder muscles. Also, what make up what we commonly refer to as your rotator cuff, right? Your teres minor, or sorry, your infraspinatus, your supraspinatus, your subscapularis, right? And then your teres minor are all part of your rotator cuff. So 4 different shoulder muscles that make up those spaces. This overall space here is your rhomboids. Your rhomboids attach to the inside of your medial border and then to your spine. And the only bit that you can see is this little triangular chunk that gets a little bit bigger as your arm starts to stretch off in one direction or another. All of this stuff here, this is all tricep stuff that we'll cover in due course when we get to the arm. So that means that your tricep is going physically over top of your lat, your shoulder muscles, right, with the exception of this here. This is really useful to know in terms of its layering, right? Because for the most part, you can't see this stuff. Okay? And even when you can see this stuff, the representation of it isn't nearly as clear as we would like, because there's a lot of flesh that gets in the way. Okay, so before I flip the page, this is a good page to screenshot, although I'll try and cram some more stuff in here. It's actually, before you screenshot, let me try and cram some stuff in. Let's say we take this arm, right, and then put it out in a raised position like this. Now what's going to happen when you do this is that all of this stuff is nice to know, right, but everything's going to change position, right? Your shoulder blade is going to change position a little bit. But not extremely so in that position. But when we raise our arm like this, right, your trapezius is going to bulge. I'm exaggerating, obviously. Your deltoid is going to bulge. And then that deltoid is going to be stretched out along that scapular spine from this section. So this part bulges, right, but at the same time, this part is stretching. So this head is bulging, this head is stretching at that point. Your triceps are at that stage, right, a really simple shape like that. My lat is also being stretched up, right, but going in behind, right, the profile of my arm. Trapezius group is shutting down that area. Because this is stretching, I'm able to see a little bit more of my rhomboid there. And then your shoulder muscles are doing this here, underneath, going underneath, and then ultimately over top of your tricep. Now this is confusing because we can't see this. Mostly what we can see when we get into that area is this. Right? Because we've got flesh here that's connecting these things, right? And that's what your tricep, lat, shoulder interaction end up looking like. Knowing that this is here, though, right, helps us to control things like a shadow shape that will be, say, falling over top of this shape, then being cast by that shape over top of this shape. Right? And then irritatingly and complexly, right, integrating with all of these smaller shapes inside of it. And this is why this area is so irritating. It's because of this shadow shapes falling over top of this, and because of this incorporation of flesh, we generally can't see this stuff. Right? And that's just as irritating from the front. Because if you look at that same position of the arm from the front, my clavicle is doing something like this. My deltoid is doing something like this as it stretches towards the outside. Trapezius is still bulging. Now my pectoral is going underneath this section. My bicep is going to be half visible from the front. And then my tricep is going to be doing something like this from the front. But now my lat, so rib cage is coming underneath there. And now my lat is coming up to about that halfway point. We're going in front of that tricep. But again, this looks like that at that point. This is even more irritating because you have this tiny little muscle called your coracobrachialis, affectionately known as your Jesus Christ muscle, because this is the only time you can see it, incorporating into that section. And this position here becomes a really, or this shape here becomes a really useful one to know, because it's a really common position of the arm, especially in a position of the arm where it's something like this, where your arm is raised up over top of the head. And you've got this horrible miss of armpit in through here. So if my arm was, say, turned entirely to the back, like this is all tricep stuff here, which means that your pectoral and your deltoid are entirely invisible from the front. It also means that your rib cage is now going to be visible, but it also means that your lat and shoulder muscles are going to be visible, but they're going to be doing something like this, where they rotate around the arm and come to the inside of the arm. Your deltoid and your pectoral are basically the same from this position. Your triceps are overlapped, right? And now you're able to see just a little bit of a chunk of deltoid from this position. And so that becomes a really useful pattern to memorize. Likewise, if we open that up a little bit from the front, so that now I had less of a perspective twist. And the arm is now raised, but now more open to the front. So it's tucked in behind the head. Your deltoid and your pectoral, again, essentially become the same shape. This line here, by the way, lines up pretty nicely with your nipple. And that line there lines up pretty nicely with the bottom of that branch of the abdominal arc, which also lines up pretty nicely with the internal section of, or the external section of your central abdominal tract, which ultimately will line up nicely with your pelvic plate as well. So this going up toward that. Now again, your rib cage is going to go in behind here. Now you can think about your bicep and your tricep roughly splitting down the middle of this overall shape. And now this stuff here has to get basically inserted there. And then you'll get this little tiny wedge of triangular chunk of space there. I'm trying real hard to cram this into one page. Okay, and then you'll be able to see just a little tiny chunk of deltoid left over there. Again. That, ladies and gentlemen, is your shoulder. Screenshot that. Because this will be a useful reference point for you. Now, Mr. Ezra, could I get you to do a pose that is something like this with one arm? And so your arm raised up behind your head like that. And oh yeah, let's do that. That's a good one. And then we'll do that same thing from the front, but with the opposite arm so that, you know, it doesn't become a nightmare for you. Okay, so again, this all presupposes gestural stuff. Right, that center line becomes crucial for controlling perspective twist. Right, as does, you know, this stuff that we were doing right from the beginning of time, right, in terms of controlling that perspective twist as well. You can see pretty clearly how your rib cage is functioning underneath that space. You can also pretty clearly see now how your scapular spine is shifting. Right, so this ledge right here is showing that your scapula is moving up like that. And then that's what's forcing this shape here to be in that position. And so as soon as you identify that, Right? That becomes a really useful way now of locking in where your trapezius group has to be, right? So your trapezius group is going to be now doing this, and then also going to be responsible for what's creating this bulge over here, right? As well as separating it from the scapular spine and rib cage on the other side. Now your arm is going to be following this general trajectory. So this is a really simplified way of putting that arm in. Now we're looking for this bulge. And you can see how much that stretches. And then looking for the rough center line of the tube that is the arm, because that's where that has to connect. And as I mentioned, this is now going to bulge on the medial head. And that's why we get that chunk of space there, right? Which is going to create an additional contour and bulge for your trapezius group. So if you want, it's like you've got two different heads of your deltoid occurring here. And that's why we have this complex change of direction. Now, all of your shoulder muscles and your lat have to now originate here. And this goes up over top of this and then underneath your arm. And then we can follow the general trajectory of this all the way back down to the base of the spine. Again, this is why that center line is important. So this is all lat stuff here. And you can see the belly of that lat right about there represented by that shoulder. So this is where the lat is bulging, representing by that shadow. Underneath that, you now have your teres major, which is going in the same direction. And then your teres minor and your infraspinatus that are now going up like this. But I can't see that overlap because those things are covered, to your great surprise and horror, by the shadow of that posterior deltoid that's then casting a shadow over top of your infraspinatus, and that is then going over top of all of this stuff that is then obscured by the smooth transition from that into your lat. Right? This is arm stuff that we'll get into at another point. So all this basically does is gives you landmarks in terms of where these shadow shapes start to have to occur. And here, these are the rhomboids that I was talking about. Inside that section. Thanks, Ezra. That was great. All of this stuff down in here, that's all oblique stuff. Okay, so inside this section here, now, because we've got this represented, I could do, and Pedro, this will kind of like accentuate your question from the first half of class. There's a nice transition line. That transition line is then going to be casting a shadow that's going to develop reflective light inside that shadow as it starts to move over top of your shoulder muscles. And then as those lines interrelate with each other, now we get a topographical change of direction. So each time that that changes contour, as it goes from here into here into here, each time that that happens, we get a transition line, reflective light, cast shadow, or reflective light, cast or transition line, or turning edge, depending on how you talk about it. And each time that you do that, what you get is this change of volume. So it's like, rather than going over a flat surface, now what we're going over is a surface that looks something like that. That's can be accentuated by literal lines or by these shadow characteristics. Ezra, let's do the same thing with the other arm now to give that arm of yours a break, but from the front. Yeah, that's great. Perfect. Okay, so again, this does nothing to affect your gesture, right? Other than some of these relationships should start making things a little bit easier to deal with. So as you find that central or that center line, this now gives you a point of reference in terms of where your pectoral has to be. This simplified arm growing out of this space now gives an easier way of now attaching your pectoral deltoid combination. This angle basically tells you where that's going. And now your deltoid and trapezius are all smushed into this area, right? But your deltoid and your pectoral basically become the same thing from this position. Your rib cage comes up underneath that. Okay? And as I mentioned, this line now, as we track it down, lines up with the nipple, also comes down to where your rib cage starts to move into your floating ribs, also moves into the interior section of your central abdominal tract, which also moves into the top of your pelvic girdle, where your leg muscles are going to attach. So this is a really useful relationship to look for because it separates all of that stuff. Now inside here, we've got a halfway point, roughly speaking, of this basic shape of the arm. Your lat and your shoulder muscle now have to come up and go over top of your tricep. And then this area in here, your armpit, it has this little triangular wedge of space, which is that tiny little muscle that I talked about, right, which then has to go in behind your rib cage because it's attached to your shoulder blade. So now all of that gives us an opportunity of then creating this big shadow shape. So that's your basic representation of what's happening inside that area. And then all of that structural stuff gives us a way of now doing a couple of different things. One, I can change the contour of this. And so start to develop volume like that. But I can also start to now accentuate each of these turning edges in turn and expose the reflective light inside those areas as a way of starting to accentuate those areas. Okay, so everything, thank you, Ezra, that's great. So everything that we've been doing, right, with respect to those basic shapes, that shade and shadow stuff, etc., right, and the basic proportions and relationship of the arm, right, has been reflective of more complicated relationships like this, right? And this is critical to understand, is that this only starts to make a difference at a certain point. This makes no difference whatsoever to try to apply before you've got basic structures and basic proportions and basic relationships to put this stuff on top of. Right? There's lots of different ways of understanding how to make sense of the pose and how to represent the pose. Generally speaking, the simpler the better to start off, and then try to apply this more complicated stuff to deepen your understanding of it as we move forward. Okay, that's lots of me talking, more than enough of me talking. Ezra, let's finish with 2 20-minute poses, shall we? Let's get a little bit closer to the camera, and let's do one that shows off your shoulders from the back, one in a difficult position, say move your shoulder forward, so to speak, right? The other one in a relaxed position. And then we'll do the same thing, I think, from like a 3/4 pose, but concentrating on the, but from the back, a 3/4 back pose. All right, gang.